for man.
Yeah. So
But it's very interesting.
microphone for the. No, thank you very much for those extra references. What is particularly interesting with the word epistrophe, and I quoted from proposition 146 of the elements of theology of Proclus specifically, because they are contemporaries with Nonos. So this is really the Neoplatonism and of that time. But there is something more in the word epistrophe, in the way Nonos and Proclus uses it, I think, which is a relation with anagoge. And as we've seen this morning, we only have the part which is from earth to heaven, but we don't have the epistrophe, which will be the other half of the circle, which will be the reincarnation and going back to us. So that is interesting for me, because this passage of epistrophe precisely is only related to the movement up, of course, and this is only the anagoge. So that's what. Yes, it's. I'm very interested by what you said, and thank you.
It's a big question,
Certainly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Some more questions or observations? Okay, so I think we can start with the last session, session D. And I'm happy to introduce Professor Anil Kumar Singh, who holds the Greek chair at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and who will lecture about the social dimensions of the cultural interaction between India and the Hellenistic world. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So many areas have been already covered, from philosophy to archaeology. What should I say? I am unable to recollect my thoughts, but there are certain points which come to my mind, and I will just underline them and request you all to think over them, and maybe in pursuance of the answer of these problems, we can find some wisdom or more knowledge about the Greek-Indian interaction since the ages. One was pointed by our colleague Delphine. We know that from the very ancient times, we know that during the Indus Valley civilization and afterwards, in the northwest of India, there was burial of dead, not the cremation. But then slowly this cremation of Indians started in a state of burial. I think this was the influence of the Greeks. And if we see it in present day's context, it's very strong ritual of Hinduism. So, question one, were there some very important rituals of Hinduism which are very significant, which actually represent the dharma, originated in Greece? That is one question which comes to our mind. There are certain explanations. If we see from the Sanskrit text point of view, we will see that there is no mention of Greek or Greeks in that sense that it was having a profound impact on India in any way. Because India for Indians was totally different from the India for classical authors. For authors who were coming from Greece, India was a foreign country, and it was the area, basically northwest frontier, which we all know. And that part was perhaps not very important part of India, of the Madhya Desh or the Dakshinapad. So Uttarapath and Dakshinapath were having two different important areas in text, and there was a lot of difference between the society of Uttarapath and Dakshinapath. And one more path was there, Shwetapath, which was introduced to us, or about which we discussed yesterday after the Yami's presentation or his note on Shwetapath. So this Uttarapath, most of the social society, nature of the social ritual, it was changing in different time periods. Before the Hellenistic age, just before the Hellenistic age, till this part, northwest frontier, was the 20th or maybe a Satrapi or a part of Persian Empire. The nature of the society was a little different. It was more akin with the society of Uttarapath. But after the Indo-Bactrian or Bactrian Empire, and the people, when they came into contact with Bactria, the nature of the society began changing. This part of the world was surely in contact with the West since ages, as I mentioned yesterday also, that before Alexander's arrival, there are evidences or literary evidences that maybe some philosophers came in 6th century, 5th century, and we know there was a lot of interaction in the courts of various heresies, etc., between the Greeks and Indians to Persian Empire. So ideas and thoughts were definitely coming up. But when these colonies were established after the Alexander, during the Seleucid Empire, and the language, Greek language became important language of the area. And as we see that Ashoka was putting his inscriptions in Greek as well as in Ramaic and Prahar. So, and it was being read by the common man. So most of the society was influenced by the language, through language with literature, through literature with culture as well. During this time, maybe this interaction with the, in the eyes of it was a foreign impact, or as we see that in the Madhya Desha, or which was not a little far from this area, maybe in the central India, which was more Brahmanical in nature. The coming of these influences were considered as an impurity. It was not considered as purity. So, if we see the texts of Madhya Desha, they are describing this area or the place where the interaction of Greeks, Bactrian, and Indian were taking place. As not a very good land, not a very good society. They saw people Urshankal, as the word is used, they're not very disciplined, and they don't follow dharma, and their behavior is unruly. Such type of description of the people of this area has been done in the text of the Madhya Desha, that is Central India, or the area where the orthodox Brahminical thought was prevalent. This area has been defined such even in epics, Mahabharata and Madhya Desha, or about Madhuri or Gandhara or all this. Why this was happening actually? The reason was the coming of Greeks together with the Buddhism and taking a stand against the ritualism of Brahmanical thought. So there were two lines of thought. One was the textual Upanishadic thought, which was talking about the knowledge and wisdom and higher things of human life. Another was the common life, common man, how they were tackling this coming of new ideas, cultural rituals, religious thoughts into day-to-day life. So, freedom of, there were more choices with the coming of new ideas and thoughts, choices to accept new ideas and to implement those in their lives, and more freedom rather than the a little close society with more disciplined life, and the idea of purity and impurity, that was also important. So there was a clear demarcation of the type of society and people in Northwest India and in the Central India. With time, as this interaction grew, we know that period of Indo-Greek rulers in this part is for sure at least 22 Greek rulers ruled in this part of the world, which is a longer period. Even if we give average 10 years, at least for 200 years, the Greek kings or Greek people were influential in this area, which was, and through this area was coming, whosoever was coming towards the Central India. So the society was facing new ideas, accepting new ideas, interacting with new cultural ideas, and it was very flexible and changing fast in comparison of the other parts or the inner parts of India. And in this way, language also changes through this interaction. So we see with this, except from thought, architecture, if we talk about architecture, big huge temples and the statues of the gods and goddesses perhaps were not available till 6th, 7th century or maybe later. Dashavatar temple is a temple of around 9th century or 10th century, sir. What is the time of Dashavatar? 5th century. So we see that even the concept of temple in Hinduism and the big sculptures of for the purpose of worship, it has somehow, it is maybe my perception, maybe wrong, the archaeologists may further research upon it, that they came from Greece, because paganism, if we see the time of even the Uttara Vedika or later on, we don't find the concept of temple and the sculpture of big sculptures till in Hinduism, especially in Hinduism. We know that the Greek technician, Greek technology, and the Buddhism were closer, and we have big statues of Buddha, big iconography related to Buddha was well developed. But the making of sculptures and temples for Hinduism, for Hindu thoughts, was much later, 9th, 10th century, especially started 9th, 10th century in big way, and we find the finest temples in 10th, 11th, 12th century, not before that. So, coming off the idea of temples, big statue to India, central part, Hinduism was maybe a Greek idea which came interacting with Persian as well as through the Buddhism up to the Hinduism. First interaction was with Persian lands, then Northwest Buddhist land, which is still Takshila, all these were Buddhist land, and then to Hinduism. So if we see the present society of India, many things are there which originated actually in society, in general masses, maybe they started through Greece, had their journey through Persia, came to Northwest frontier, and then there was a huge debate and interaction between Brahminical thought and Buddhist thought, and later on, whatever society we see today, is a result of these interactions, cultural interactions, and the result there. So these are some ideas which come to my mind when we talk about the relationship of Greece and India. So maybe more things may be elaborated later on. If you want to, at this point of time, something comes to your mind, you just tell me so that I can more elaborate on this thought. Any one of you, if you can come in, we will elaborate upon this point. Well, interaction will make me more comfortable. Want to say something? Huh?
Nothing.
No, please tell me.
No.
No, it's expert. We are learning, we all are learning. So, Professor Dhyanath Tripathi wrote a book on Hellenism and Hinduism, and there are many similarities between from ancient times to modern times. So, all when we talk about Hinduism, Hindu society, the debate between the Hinduism and Hellenism is long, and we believe that I believe at least that modern Hindu system, Hindu society, Hindu religion, and the day-to-day social rituals have originated or have their origins in great thought. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this lecture, quite sensitive to the social aspect of the interaction, which is something we should always think of, I think. Now it is my pleasure to ask Professor Renu Shukla of the Department of Ancient History, Culture and Archaeology of the Gurukula Kangri University to come and lecture on the theme representation of interfaith dialogue in Milindapañha. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, I'm thankful to both the organizing institutions, Hellenic Institute of Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies, and we chair Renu for making it possible for us to be here today and interact with the scholars like you. And I'm also grateful to Professor Renu, who has been the motivating force behind all our efforts in this particular direction. Since we are the students of the same professor, so I will carry forward the same idea and whatever Dr. Anil just said about the Northwest region. So I will talk more about that, of course, with particular reference to Milindapañha. The dialogue with Milindapañha is a discussion on Buddhist tenets between people of two different faiths, make the multi-faith mind of the region, Northwest region of India, understand Buddhism and to develop a sense of harmony amongst them. The captivating Buddhist masterpiece Milindapañha is considered as the most important non-canonical work of Theravada Buddhism. The date of its composition can be assumed between 1st century BC to 1st century CE. It is preserved in the Pali language, but is usually believed to be written in northern India in Sanskrit or North Indian Prakrit. The original book is lost, but there exists two versions, Pali and Chinese. The Chinese version contains only a small part of first chapter and second and third chapters of Pali version. And this particular study is based on the Pali version, means all the whole 7 chapters of the book. The book consists of a series of 262 questions raised by King Menander and answers to these questions by Singh. In ancient period, India was in more or less. Can I change this? Yes. In ancient period, India was more or less contact with people of various regions and cultures. There is evidence of at least 5 races in Harappa, Aryan and non-Aryan Vedic period were living together. Mahabharata says Bharatvarsha is inhabited by the Aryans, the late Shahs, and the Santhas. Dr. Singh has also talked about the insecurities and the kind of references we get in texts, in grammatical texts specifically. In ancient period, Persians, Yavan, Kushan, Avid, Kashak, Hunas came to India, stayed here in course of time, became an integral part of this country and social framework. The term interfaith can be interpreted in many ways, but this study discusses interfaith dialogue in the context of a positive interaction between people of diverse religious traditions and cultural background at individual level in order to increase understanding and acceptance within them and society as well. The dialogue is a testimony to the fact that the process of acculturation is not unidirectional. Mutual understanding is a natural two-way process of synthesis, which was an outcome of mutual effort, Indian and foreign, to get along with one another. In various dialogues of Milindapañha, we noticed that Buddhist tenets were interpreted differently at different times, according to the prevailing circumstances. The time of the composition of Milindapañha was a challenging one when it was the need of the hour to accommodate various beliefs and diverse cultural groups of Northwest India during that Kangri rule. The synthesis of blend of cultures has been interpreted in this presentation as interfaith discussion, which depicts an ideological shift or liberal tendency towards the prevailing in the society when Milindapañha was authored. It is composed in the form of a dialogue. The dialogue and discussions between people on religious and philosophical affairs have been a part of the Indian culture since the beginning of civilization on this land. Grammatical texts, especially Upanishads, contain various episodes of such discussion, which are followed by the Buddhist tradition as well. Buddhist literature is full of interactions between Buddha, Buddhist monks and nuns, lay disciples, and people of other religious beliefs. Emperors like Ashoka and Akbar also followed the same tradition. Here are a few important dialogues from Upanishads, dialogue between Yagyavalkya with King Janak, with Maitri and Gargi, with the dialogue of Nachiketa with Yam, and Pravahan Javali with Shvetketu and his father Aruni. And some other dialogues, like dialogues of Krishna with Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita, Buddha with prominent thinkers of his time, and Buddhist monks and nuns, dialogue of Soma with Mar, which occurs in Therigatha, and Puna with Brahmins. And dialogue of Shankaracharya with Bandhan, which is very prominent in this particular context. So these illuminating discussions among people having faith in different ideologies have been very fruitful in order to respond to the queries of common people, to resolve the dilemmas in the religious beliefs, and to increase the number of the followers of the concerned groups, and to develop a sense of understanding amongst them. A unique example of such a conversation is available to us in the form of Milindapañha, which is a philosophical conversation between Milind and Singh. The book is an excellent example of an interaction between two people belonging to two different cultural groups, India and Greece, which has no parallel in history apart from its doctrinal, philosophical, and religious importance in Buddhism. This work has received warm welcome from the academic circle as well. The first character is Milinda, which is who has been identified with the Bactrian Greek king Menander Soter. He was one amongst around 42 Bactrian Greek monarchs who ruled in Northwest India, the only one who is admired by both his Greek and Indian subjects. We may assume that because of his inquisitiveness and contribution to the religion of Buddha, he has been chosen as one of the two principal characters of the dialogue. Milinda's representation as a person having keen interest in discussion and dialogue with scholarly people is pivotal, around which the whole conversation of Milindapañha revolves. If the references of the textbook is interest in Indian philosophy and religion on one hand, and his doubts about it on the other, he is said to have been engaged in debating with the prominent thinkers from different traditions for 12 long years before meeting Singh, and often confounding them with his urban wit and penetrating insight. This quality of Milinda is noticed in the long discussion held between him and Buddhist monk on the cardinal points of Buddhist doctrine. In this context, it is also worth mentioning here that the text refers to Menander's meeting with Puran Kasab and Makkali Gosal, who were the founders of different ideological schools. And these two, both these two were the contemporaries of Buddha. So they lived there for about 500 years before Milind. And so we can say that these meetings would never held actually. He has been portrayed, Milinda has been portrayed as a man of wisdom who is well aware of Buddhist doctrine, carrying the image of a wise philosopher. With a critical bent of mind, he becomes an enthralling character for us. Another prominent character is Singh, who played a leading role in the text, seems to represent the author's mindset while answering the questions put forth before him by Melinda. Certain stories fabricated around Singh are not mentioned in the Chinese translation of the book. Perhaps these stories were created to enhance his prestige as a teacher. Milindapañha does not furnish much information about Singh on account of the places and names mentioned in the text. Lauritzen concludes that the author of the book resided in northwest India in Punjab itself, whereas some others connect him with Kashmir region of Jammu. Singh's historicity has not been proved by any source, and the kind of excellence he possesses might be a fantasy instead of reality. It can be assumed that the author himself played the role of this perfect teacher of Buddhism to present Buddhism as the supreme religion of his time. So far as the historicity of the dialogue is concerned, we have two contradictory approaches. One has declared Milindapañha propaganda text and a philosophical conversation between the two leading players as author's imagination. According to T.W. Davis, we have before us is a book of didactic ethics cast into the form of historical romance. Contrary to this, Mrs. C.F. writes that in the 1st century BC, court clerk of Milinda made a record of 20 of their dialogues which were engraved on copper plates. These dialogues were later produced in book form, and its translations are available in various languages. A careful study of Milindapañha suggests that although it seems to be a dialogue between the two characters, but in reality it is a monologue. The whole story is laid in a very systematic way with a clear motive to sort out certain issues related to Buddha's statements in Buddhist ideology. But this perspective dominates throughout the book and leaves no room for any kind of alleged interview or dialogue between Milinda and Singh. This is further proven by the fact that Singh's role is authoritative, while that of Milinda is subordinate to him, and also as all the dilemmas and questions were put into his mouth and solutions came from Singh. Milindapañha represents the time when a part of Northwest India was under Bactrian rule. So it was the need of the hour to accommodate various beliefs and diverse cultural groups of Northwest India. Numerous references in Indian literature prove that initially Indians resisted against the foreigners on social plane. The initial resistance stayed away gradually, and these rulers were taken into Indian social religious fold. The dialogue is a testimony to the fact that mutual understanding is a natural two-way process of synthesis, which was an outcome of the Indian and foreign effort to get along with one another. Therefore, the ideological shift and growing liberal tendency towards religious beliefs is the highlight of the book. The significance of the dialogue lies in the fact that it is a symbol of process of acculturation, testimony of Menander's, it is closely with Buddhism, and it informs us about his conversion to Buddhism. The significance of dialogue also lies in the fact that extensive distribution of Menander's coin on moreover 20 locations around Indus area, Kabul Valley, and Western United Province prove his political activities, but so far as his interest in indigenous philosophy is concerned, this is something unique which we get to know from this text. This is the introductory part of Milindapañha, which gives a very positive description of Lower country and Sagar city. And it shows that Greek rule was popular in Indian community, more specifically in Buddhist community of their territory. Their existence no doubt changed the political history of the country, but more than that, they equally contributed to the mainstream of Indian culture. The description clearly indicates towards the presence of different leading thinkers of the time in Sagal and broad-minded, generous people of the city. I have highlighted certain portions of the text which are important in this regard. Initially, Indian response was not positive. The suspicions and fears can be seen in the references of Mahabharata and Puran. But initial resistance by the Indians did not persist for long. It gradually subsided and the foreigners were accepted. Indian learns about the Hellenic culture. The class of educated Indian was familiar with Hellenic epics, poetry, mythology, and drama. The foreign rulers also facilitated in the process by paying respect to the religious beliefs of the native people, adopting Indian names, manufacturing coins according to the Indian standard, issuing bilingual coins, either using either Kharoshti or Brahmi along with Greek, displaying symbols and deities of various Indian faiths on some of the coins, promoting charitable deeds and intermarrying with native people of the land. Pali books and inscriptions provide numerous Indianized being of Ronak tongues. Classical Greek literature contains several instances which prove that Greeks had a tradition of uncritical admiration for Indians and were interested in having interaction with Indian philosophers. We have discussed in our late presentation was statements and all that. The interest in Indian religion and philosophy is evident from the long discussion on Buddhist tenets in Milindapañha. The choice of Menander and Narsingh as its two characters prove that it is representative of the process of goodwill and synthesis between both the cultures. Milindapañha also provides us a list of 75 occupations, which indicates towards the economic growth of the Greek ruled territories in India. The references of Milindapañha indicate the economic growth and under foreign rule, which resulted in social and occupational mobility also. The references of this text indicate a close link between Menander and Buddhism. The selection of Menander as one of the principal characters of Milindapañha itself is a testimony of the fact that Menander had shared a special bonding with religion of Buddha. It also contains the information of his conversion to Buddhism. His deep association with Buddhism is supported by the other sources as well. The inscription found over the Buddhist relic casket of Bajar refers to the 14th day of a month of Kartik of a certain year in the reign of Maharaja Minad is clear evidence of his concern for Buddhism. The evidence of Buddhist monument at Pushkalavati and Kangri show that Buddhism was popular in Milinda's territory. In Milindapañha and Bodhisattva Vadan Kalpata, we get the references of construction of Vihar and Stup by Milind. According to a reference of the Mahavansh, Theriyu Mahadhambarati went to Sri Lanka to attend the ceremony of dedication of a great stup in Anuradhapur along with 30,000 Buddhist monks from the Greek city of Alessandra on the invitation of Singh, who were the contemporary of Menander. The exaggerated number of monks suggests that Buddhism was popular in that region, and that time Greek monks played a direct role in the upper hierarchy of Buddhism and its dissemination. So also evidences are testimony to the profound regard of Oriental amongst Buddhists and also to the support and encouragement Buddhism. These are some of the evidences which shows cultural interactions. The text informs about Milinda's conversion. So these are the lines. The theory of the conversion of Milind given in Milindapañha is highly debatable issue. And it suggests that Menander handed over his kingdom to his son and became a monk. On the contrary, Plutarch says that Menander died an accidental death in a camp. And Osman Peperinci support Plutarch's idea by giving numismatic evidence based on analysis of legend, portrait, found on series of coins of his statue and other Agathoclea. He concludes that Menander's widowed wife Agathoclea was a regent during the infancy of her son Stefanos. And with the growth of his son, Agathoclea gradually ceases to be the regent. And he on the basis of monograms, he says the same thing. And Francois Weidman also relates the huge quantity and inferior quality of Menander's coins to his warlike activities, restless warlike activities. I would like to give you a reference from Milindapañha, which rejects his conversion. So the first thing is that, as I have said, that the Chinese version of the Milindapañha contains only a small chapter of Pali text, and the information of his conversion comes at the end of Milindapañha in the form of an epilogue. So there is a question mark on the authenticity of this particular portion. And in Milindapañha also gives us information that he joined the order, indicates his refusal to become a monk. Milinda says in a reference that as a lion, the king of beasts, when put into a cage, though it were of gold, is still facing outside. Even so do I live as master in the house, but remain facing outside. But I were to go forth from home to homelessness, I would not live long, so many are my enemies. So in this instance, Milinda expresses his inability to renunciate because of the threat of life if he does. And the most important thing of this particular conversation is its doctrinal value. It is the earliest evidence of the existence of 3 Pitakas and 5 Nikayas. It contains the name of all the 7 books of Abhidhamma. The various Buddhist principles like Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, Theory of Independent Co-origination, Law of Impermanence, Non-Self, Combined Rebirth, Nibbana occupy a prominent position in Milindapañha. Apart from it, Milindapañha has also attempted to clarify matters which remain hazy in the suttas. One of the most significant aspects to be talked about Milindapañha is that it presented some unique idea with a different approach towards the various Buddhist structures. There is mention of the concept of bhakti, transfer of merit, worship of the relics of Buddha, it showcases Nibbana in the same category with worldly gains, and dilution in theory of karmic retribution, belief exists in the non-karmic causes of human suffering, etc. So these can be seen as moderate reforms of the Dehradun position and the acceptance of popular folk beliefs in Buddhism. So this positive transformation in Buddhism has made the conversation of Milindapañha very significant and interesting. Actually, there are reasons behind this change. Milindapañha derives later date than to the Pali canonical text, and it is said to be written in a language other than Pali. The impact of its cultural surroundings can be seen on the composition of the text, which made it historically important and throws light on the cultural diversity of the region. The period of it marked by the rise of Bhakti cult, which believed in equal rights for all, assimilation of foreigners who have become too important to be ignored, and also improve and they started making efforts to gain the goodwill of the native people with the view to improve and strengthen their status, the growth of mercantile class, and the people of humble origin. According to the prevailing circumstances, the conversation of Milindapañha was authored to coordinate the divergent views or to settle the rival claims about the authenticity of Buddha's sayings. Prevailing circumstances, generous behavior of Indo-Greeks, compulsions of the time, and Indian acceptability for organic beliefs were the factors which developed a conducive environment for the synthesis of two cultures, which manifested depth in the sphere of religion. The interfaith dialogue of Milindapañha was spent to fulfill the need of the hour, to coordinate the divergent views or to settle rival claims about the authenticity of Buddha's sayings. The analysis of Milindapañha and other evidences suggests that under the active rule, socially and culturally, there were two different worlds, Greek and native, and sometimes they seem to build up a tradition of hospitality towards the people of varied beliefs and traditions, but at times relapse to their own distinctive way of life and culture.
Thank you very much. A rich lecture, and I think that my colleagues, Byzantinists, like me, were a little bit upset thinking about these interreligious, interfaith dialogues, which are so open and so open to acceptance, because in Byzantium there are so many interreligious dialogues, which in fact are totally fictitious, and they also want to show simply that Christianity and Orthodoxy are absolutely superior to all the rest, to all the other religions. But after all, then you said that also this dialogue is somehow a monologue. So I think that also Byzantinists were a little bit happier. Well, it's not just what the Polignac and Asiatic or the pensée unique, not only in Byzantium, but it's just a joke. So now it is my pleasure to ask our friend, Dr. Frederick Lauritzen of the Scuola Grande di San Marco, to come and to talk about Indians in the 11th century in Constantinople. Thank you very much. And please switch off your telephones.
I'd like to thank the organizers. I'd like to thank Professor Gurukula and Professor Arabatsis for inviting me here to speak, and also Professor Anil, Kumar Singh, and Milindapañha, so that I'm very grateful to be here and to have the chance to talk about my favorite century, the 11th century. So there I'm on home ground, which is always much more fun for me. This talk in somehow is the second half of the talk I gave in Delhi in December, which was about the diplomatic exchanges between Byzantium and India. So now I'm focusing rather than on a period over centuries, I'm focusing on one century in particular. India was central to the imagination of Byzantine Greeks in the 11th century. It is astonishing to think that there are more references probably to India between 1000 and 1080 to all of Western Europe combined. The Latin world was culturally insignificant compared to India for the Byzantine imagination. Astonishing is the presence of the life of Buddha in Greek at this time. The story has been translated and was present in Constantinople by the year 1048, when it was rendered into Latin. Barlameñosaf is the story of two saints. Barlam was a monk, and Yosaf was king. It was who persecuted Christians until he converted precisely by Barlam. Philologists have enjoyed focusing on the path of translations. Footnotes about translations from Arabic into Georgian and then into Greek. The Greek version from the 11th century adds texts lacking in previous ones. Aristides' Apology for Christianity being an important example. It indicates that the work was remodeled for a Greek-speaking audience. So there's an element of reception, which is very important in Constantinople. This remodeling did not remove the Indian aspect. On the contrary, it is absolutely central. And this you can see in the passage on the slide. And here I quote, "The so-called land of the Indians lies beyond Egypt. It is large and populous. On the Egyptian side, it is washed by seas and navigable oceans. On the continent, it is close to the mountains of Persia." The term Indian is specifically used 9 times in the story. Once it refers to the Apostle Thomas, who was sent to Kerala in 124, therefore connecting it to other stories known to the Byzantines. These are elements which show the influence of Christianity on the text. It is also full of biblical quotations. So obviously that means that when it was translated into Georgian and then ultimately into Greek, biblical quotations were added because they weren't present in the Muslim version previously. The tale of Barlam and Yosaf derives from a Sanskrit text. Nathan Levine has indicated that the Sanskrit source has not been found precisely, though useful comparisons may be made with the following texts: the Jataka tales, the Dinakatha, the Mahavastu, the Lali Vistara, and the Ashvagosha Buddhicharita. Sorry for the pronunciation. The Byzantine tale of Barlam and Yosaf shows a connection with genuine Sanskrit material, mediated by translations and adaptations to a Christian context of the 11th century Constantinople. Another Sanskrit text, the Panchatantra, was also rendered into Greek at this same time. The story of Stefanos and Ichmelatis, originally the Kalilawa Dimna in Arabic. However, the tale is set in India again, with yet another Indian king who discusses with a philosopher. The Greek version gives prominence to 2 jackals, precisely named Stefanos and Ichmelatis. This feature indicates that this version of the story derives from a Persian translation of the 6th century. It is a text which entered Persian culture during the period of the Gupta Empire in India. Thus, we have 2 texts which ultimately come from India and reach Constantinople in the 11th century, a Buddhist and a Hindu one. One may mention another text translated slightly later in 1105 by Michael Andreopoulos, the Syntipas. It's a Persian story set in Persia with King Cyrus the Great, but the protagonist has a Sanskrit name deriving from Siddhapatha, the path of wisdom, I think that is. Both texts present common themes, that is the Stefanos Ichmelatis and the Barlam and Yosaf, obviously interesting to the Byzantines. And again, it's important to look at the receiving end of these stories. A king discussing with a philosopher at court. It appears to be the only point which really concerns the Byzantines, the king and his advisor. These two texts present secular political connections between India and Constantinople, at least how they were imagined. This is what concerns structure. The content is religious and concerns moral improvement. In the case of the transformed life of Buddha, the Byzantines specifically added the defense of Christianity, sometime between, let's say, 1021 and 1048, in Constantinople itself. There is another important 11th century manuscript which adds material to an older story. The Alexander Romance, already mentioned by Filippo Ronconi, a hugely popular story by Pseudo-Callisthenes. The oldest manuscript of recension A is a Parisinus Graecus 1711, has an important section about Indian religion. The editor Kroll, and this is why sometimes one wonders what philologists are doing, the editor Kroll removed the section which is present in the oldest and best manuscript because he found it only there. In his edition, book 3.6 is followed by paragraph 317. So even the numbering, he accepts that there is 11 chapters missing from the actual edition. This is on page 106 of his edition, if you're curious. Kroll believed it was added for the manuscript, but is irrelevant to reconstitute the original story. In other words, it represents, according to Kroll, an 11th century interest. The text added is a description of India and the Brahmins. It inserts the entire text of Palladius entitled Concerning India and the Brahmins, and covers 6 folia from 614 verso to 420 verso. The text describes Indian religious practices of the Brahmins. And here I quote the passage, which is in English. He said that the Brahmins are a population which is not organized by choice, like monks are, but they receive this lot from above and out of God's decision. They live the region of the river naturally naked. There is no quadruped among them, nor a farming instrument, nor iron, nor a building, nor fire, nor bread, nor wine, nor cloak, nothing required for work or tending towards pleasure. They have pure and clean air and pleasant. They revere God and are wise, not in such a fine way as to be able to analyze the arguments of fate, and yet they pray incessantly. They pray directed to the sky instead of to the east. They do not pay attention to the movement of the rising sun. This passage comes after the description of the king of Sri Lanka in the same text and their connections with Rome. It is clearly a text written long after Alexander the Great, which reflects the status quo of the 4th century of the Christian era. This is Palladius. The class of the Brahmins is described in similar terms in the legal code of Manu, the Manusmriti, which defines the duties of the Brahmins in section 226 to 696. One may choose the passage of the wandering hermit in particular. Again, this is on the slide in English. To achieve success, he must always wander alone, without any companions, recognizing that success comes to the solitary man. He'll forsake no one and no one will forsake him. He should live without fire or house, enter a village to obtain food, be dispassionate, keep no store, remain silent, sage, and mentally composed. Hold the foot of a tree, a ragged piece of cloth, a solitary life, and equanimity towards all. These are the marks of the renouncer. These two texts seem to refer to the same way of life. However, it is worth remembering that the Greek text was composed within a Christian context when Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. We have seen how the Byzantines were interested in the relation between a king and his counselor. The same interest is present in the Manusmrti, the Indian law code. Section 763-68 of Manus's code describes how a king should choose his envoys to go abroad. The ambassador should be selected for his eloquence, which is obvious, but it's stated at 764. The description seems to fit specifically with the Brahmins, which are obviously a category which is studied specifically in this text. This brings us to another Greek manuscript, which according to Pinakes transmits Palladius's description of India and the Brahmins. This is also from the 11th century, but is not within the Alexander Romance, but among the works of oratory and rhetoric, Vaticanus Graecus 107, according to Pinakes. The 10th century manuscripts, which transmit Palladius's description of India and the Brahmins, tend to have monastic texts. It seems that India in the 10th century was of religious interest within the Greek monastic circles. This is comprehensible when one turns to Palladius's description of the dialogue between the Brahmin Dandamis and Alexander the Great. And here I quote one passage, which is on the slide. Dandamis listened and smiled gracefully. He did not raise his head from the leaves, but laughed at him and lying down answered, God, the great emperor, never generates offense, but light, peace, life, and water, the human body and souls. He accepts them when fate loosens those which are not tamed by desire. He is my Lord and only God. He sends away death. He does not fabricate wars. Such a concept is often associated with Indian thought. It is present in the Manusmrti 1063 and in other passages too. This is just one I picked. So here I quote the translation of Olivel: abstention from injuring, truthfulness, refraining from anger, purification, and mastering the organs. This, Manu has declared, is the gist of the law of the four classes. Manusmrti 1063. Such a passage illustrates why Byzantine monks would be interested in such reports of Indian beliefs. In the 11th century, there is also something diplomatic and political, which is interesting. If one turns to one such advisor in Constantinople, the consul of philosophers, Michael Psellos, by the way, is very important, not because he's an author I like particularly, but because he wrote over 1,000 works preserved in 1,700 manuscripts. So he's a bestseller by medieval standards. We see that he has some sort of direct knowledge of Sanskrit. This is a truly problematic question, and I'm throwing it to you to solve it somehow. In an essay he wrote about amber, he gives this text, which I quote. In the area of India, there flows a river, which is 2 stadia wide. It is called Spabaros, which in Greek means which brings all good things. This means the word is not a Greek word, it's a foreign word. The river, he says, carries amber for 40 days a year. They say that a mountain overlooks the river and it has great trees from which drip tears into the river. When they fall, they harden and become amber. The name of the trees is Xetakora, which in Greek means sweet. Psellos indicates 2 Indian words and gives their meanings. Spabaros, meaning that which carries all good things, and Xetakora, which means sweet. Both of these words appear in no other text in Greek, and that is the problem in the secondary literature, because they don't know what's happened. Almost finished. So this may seem like antiquarianism based on previous and ancient accounts. The problem is that this is the only attestation of these 2 words and of its meaning, as already pointed out by such scholars as Paul Maas and Bigwood as well, more recently. Xetakora seems to be the equivalent of Chitahara, which means pine sugar. A compound of chara, according to specialists, Prakrit or Sanskrit Kshara. Oh, and the word chit in Hindi apparently means pine. The river Spabaros appears to be a deformation of Vishav and Bara, which means bears in all directions. If Pselos, if Pselos wrote Pantu instead of Panta, and I haven't seen the manuscript here, then it would be a direct translation. If Pselos was listening to experts rather than quoting an inexistent source of Ctesias about India, we have a problem. It would mean that the interest in wise Indians in the 11th century was not due to an awareness, an obscure and distant past, but due to direct contact. And the reason why this is a possibility is that the scholar who identified Korre as being the pine sugar, where the word chit meaning pine, indicates that that's not Sanskrit or Prakrit, but it's actually Hindi. He's using a Hindi word. I don't know if that is correct, but that's what he says. And therefore, the word must be much later than previous contacts. Parlamagnosa, Stephanitis and Ichnellatis, the Alexander Romance show an interest in Brahmins. The Indian ideas found in these texts, and specifically Palladius, echo those present in Manusmrti, the law code which is devoted to promoting the role and behavior of Brahmins in politics. In Greek literary texts, foreign words are avoided. It is therefore surprising to find the word Brahmin in Pselos's letter to a friend. And here I quote the translation: I seem to you to be writing even if I don't, for I converse with you with my imagination, and I see you with the eye of the soul. Even if you do not send me a letter, I consider you have answered me in your heart, for such is the philosopher. He is independent in his soul, and he is not held down by the body. Nor is he confined by the sensible eyes, nor is he a prisoner by defined limits. He is free, with mysterious wings, and wherever the lovers and beloved may be, whether among the Indians or Brahmins, even if they reach the limits of the earth, he finds them immediately by the unconstrained movement of his thoughts. It appears to be a rhetorical image, but the details we have discussed are present. The freedom from passions, the soaring of the soul are easily found in Greek literature as well as Indian. If one combines the elements of this passage with the two previous stories derived from Sanskrit and the knowledge of Brahmin practices described in Palladius in terms reminiscent of Manusmrti, it is reasonable to consider that the Byzantines were fascinated by India, possibly by direct contact. This also argued in December. That would explain why the 11th century writer Simeon Seth refers to plants coming from India as well as Tibet specifically, and seems to be aware of trade beyond India, not only the island of Socotra, but also Malaysia, apparently. That would imply trade routes that are going through India or that are used by Indians. Pselos worked in the imperial court. He knew the official translators who accompanied ambassadors to meet the emperor. It's a small world, he would have known them. He would have again met foreigners who approached the emperor in the period 1034-1078. He would have met any foreigner who approached the emperor in this period. His career began specifically with Michael IV Paphlagon, 1034-1041, who became emperor by marrying Zoe. Not only was he interested in Indian spices and essences, she had a particular devotion to an icon which would predict the future by changing color. Our source of this devotion and miracle is Pselos himself. Michael IV and Zoe were so impressed by this icon that they placed it on their coin. So they minted a coin with the icon that had been created by Zoe. This coin, minted sometime between 1034 and 1041, has been found in India and is kept in the National Museum in Delhi. And that's the image you have there. Ironically, the coin has been identified as the 9th century one, but this is an anonymous follis from Michael IV, because that is the Antiphonitis right there. To conclude, the proof of the contact with India is in the official protocol established to exchange letters between Constantinople and India. The Emperor Constantine VII, in the middle of the 10th century, wrote in his Book of Ceremonies to the superior leader of India, Constantine Romanos, that means between 920 and 944, faithful in Christ, the God, great imperial rulers of the Romans, to the name, you just fill the name of the local ruler, the superior ruler of India, our beloved friend. The greeting reveals the deep connection and courtesy between philosophers and Brahmins from the Byzantine Empire and India on a diplomatic and cultural level in 11th century Constantinople. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We are calling Frederick Lauritzen for dwelling into Celos, which is always an incredible surprise for everybody. And it is quite interesting. You quoted this at length, this Parisian manuscript, Parisianus Gregus 1711. It is useful to remember that these are manuscripts which contains Byzantine chronicles, and just in the last while, written by the same hand, the Roman Alexander, which is once again quite interesting, in my opinion, in order to think about the way Byzantines thought about this text of the Roman Alexander with this insertion on India, which was somehow part of a huge historical record. Somehow, it's quite interesting. So thank you so much. And now I would like to invite Dr. Katerina Korre of the University of Patras to come and lecture about medieval mentalities regarding India, 13th, 16th century. Thank you so much.
Thank you, dear Professor. Pleased with our section. It's always glad to be here at the Greek Institute and especially to be part of this wonderful occasion, very interesting conference. Well, medieval European perceptions of India indeed deserve the scholarly attention of historians, not so much because they offer entertainment as reflections of the collective imaginary of a topos that differed so much by any familiar experience of the medieval man in the Christian West, but because they contribute to an understanding of the West itself, how medieval Christian communities constructed or reconstructed an Indian space, attributing its key features without knowing it empirically, without having come into constant contact with it, that is a space that now on exists in a different way than it is in reality. How did they construct their own identity in view of the other, not just any other, for example, Muslim peoples of the Near East with whom they were in close contact, but an unknown other as the limits of the world they know, at the limits the world they know. How did they seek, if they sought, their own institutions within the institutions of the medieval Indian societies? How did they evaluate the latter and with what criteria? After all, with what predisposition did the Western world reach the borders of the Indian world after the 13th century, when contact was already a fact and the first Latin travelers were at last visiting the Indian territories in search of business, diplomatic, missionary, or simply sightseeing benefits? Before we proceed, two indications need to be made at this very point. First, we must always bear in mind that a large part of medieval Western conceptions of the Far East was formed under the absolute dominance of geography. There was, and still is today, in every possible sense, an imaginary region connecting India and the Middle East with the Middle East,
the area is now Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the Greek Peninsula, which has always functioned as a gateway to the European space. Of course, Byzantium was there and constituted, in terms of geography in principle, but also of common European culture, the bridge of Europe. Through this bridge, people, goods, ideas, languages, perceptions, and concepts of Asia passed to the West and vice versa. Therefore, when we talk about medieval perceptions about India, we include in them the percentage of influence that existed from the Byzantine experience, to the extent, of course, that it was transmitted seamlessly to the Latin West, something that did not happen uninterruptedly. The second point has to do with two great poles around which the worldview of the medieval man is structured: the doctrines of the Christian Church and the transfilling that is the influence of ancient texts, especially the works of the geographers of late antiquity. These two poles create a reservoir of stereotypes about the Indian region, which is deconstructed very slowly and long after the 16th century. Western Europe's knowledge of India changed surprisingly little during the Middle Ages, and certainly until the 13th, 14th century, with trade and other contacts having ceased because of the collapse of the Roman world in the face of the great movement called the migration of the barbarian peoples. The material form which medieval writers could draw information about India was mainly ancient. Isidore of Seville, 7th century, collects the ancient references, offering the conceptual and imaginary level used by the coming writers in order to present India. Which were his sources? Herodotus, who in turn introduces Persian sources, Lysias of Cnidos, the Indica of Megasthenes, the geographers, Pomponius Mela, Strabo, and Pliny, and Ptolemy, the encyclopedists of late antiquity, Pliny, Solinus, Marcianus Capella. Having spoken of the earthly paradise at the 14th book of the Etymologiarium, entitled De Terra Partibus Indiae, Isidore will describe the basic images of a country that takes its name from the river Indus and is defined by two other rivers, Ganges and Iphasis. The last river is the limit of the known world, reached by Alexander the Great. This is a historical fact confirmed in the 7th century by Isidore himself. Indian territory is an enlarged locus, a terra incognita, with entirely distinctive characteristics. It extends from the sources of the Indus River in the west, falling between Middle and Lower India, the Caucasus in the north, which is the region of the Middle East with Middle and Lower India, the South Sea in the south, and the earthly paradise of the east, comprising Upper and Lower India. Rather, it speaks of the exotic large island of Taprobana, that is Sri Lanka, of course, and the mythical islands of Krisi and Argiri, that is called the Gold and River and Silver Island, which were named after their precious substances. The climate is dominated by the southeast wind, which contributes to the euphoria of the land. 2 harvests a year are enjoyed by the cultivators and farmers in a landscape that's always vivid green. The land produces everything, from spices and vegetables to exotic fruits. The subsoil just covers veins of precious metals, gold and silver, precious stones, diamonds and pearls. Every kind of animal known and unknown survives on the Indian peninsula. The most fearsome of them, such as griffins, of course, an imaginary animal, dragons, guard the precious elements so that no one can approach and take them. The most important point is made about Indian societies. A panspermia of tribes, 9,000 tribes, 4,000 great cities, here Isidore is clearly quoting Pliny, is spread over the whole extent of Indian space. Therefore, it is impossible to calculate the human souls who are enjoying this amazing world. And this world is really wonderful, even in terms of everyday life, self-sufficient and autonomous. Indians are the only people, Isidore said, says, who never migrated for their homeland merely because it provided them with more than they could possibly need, so there was no reason to do it. Apart from the ancient accounts, a large part of the information of the Latin West is derived from the record of Alexander's campaign, as perceived by Byzantine. We had the pleasure to listen to Dr. Lauritzen about 11th century mentalities of Byzantine, of India. The account of Megasthenes, ambassador of the general of Alexander the Great and Persian ruler Seleucus I in Cato to the great Mauryan city of Pataliputra, contained detailed descriptions of provinces, cities, and peoples that form the basis of Pliny the Elder's account. Furthermore, from accurate or more or less truthful events and reports by Dimachus, Onesicritus, and Nearchus about those military events, and especially about Alexander's conflict with the Indian king Porus, the decisive battle of the river Hydaspes, with the impressive description of the elephants in his Indian military tactics. It is known that the campaign of Alexander the Great was a fascinating story in Byzantium, and that it was also interspersed with all those fantastical and even plausible elements that make the reader return again and again to the exploits of a figure who was not culturally foreign to the Byzantine public. We need only refer to Codex 5 of the narration of Alexander's campaign, a text written between the 3rd BC and the 3rd AD, which is kept in the Museum of the Hellenic Institute of Venice. Thus, in Alexander's account of India, several interpreting paths of the medieval European collective imagination can be easily traced. The circulation of this text, as evidenced by the British Library's impressive exhibition of medieval manuscripts in January 2023, the Institute had a part of this, significant part of this exhibition, was enormous. We could only mention that Alexander presented in texts such as the Archpresbyter Leo's Historia de Praelis, the Epistola Alexandria de Aristotelem, the correspondence between Alexander and Didymus, the king of the Brahmans, the Iter ad Paradisum. Furthermore, in the late medieval derivatives, Alexander encounters a stream of fabulous peoples and animals in a fictionalized setting of sometimes metaphorical wastelands, ponds, mountains, and endemic gardens. The legendary conqueror encounters and enters into dialogue with marvelous peoples such as the Gymnosophists, Brahmans, the Amazons, and even a race of part women, part flowers. These references are followed most often literally by the Latin medieval authors in whose works references to India are found. The Exceptionum Allegoricarum of Hugo St. Victor, the Speculum Naturale of Vincent of Beauvais, the De Imagine Mundi of Honorius Otton, Brunetto Latinis Livre de Trajor. All these works, like their prototype written by Isidore, share basic feature: mirabilia and teratology. The imagination of the writers moves in two levels. First, in constructing a series of progressive exaggerations about the natural world, islands of gold and silver, mountains of precious stones, monstrous animals, mythological or completely imaginary beings, and in the construction of representations of the inhabitant of the Indian hinterland. Hence, for these habits and some examples of social institution, the most impressive is the teratomorphic collection of people. According to these accounts in southern India, one could see Amiktire, men with huge lips who use them as umbrellas. Antipodes, people who walk upside down. Blemius, headless people. Epiphany, people with eyes on their shoulders, etc. Also different types of supermen. Hippopodes, people with large horse legs that mean to run as fast. Ichthyophagy, amphibious men. Macrobes, you don't remember that, those who live over a century. Giants, one-eyed one-eyed and with the power of the mythical polyphemus. One immediately realizes that the collective medieval fantasy is shaped by ancient mythology, but also by the innermost fears of the Christian church. They are chthonic beings, far from the human condition, which is familiar and therefore psychologically reassuring for the Europeans. After all, animality, for St. Augustine, was almost the proof of the demonic element. We shall not go into the relevant case load, which has resulted in forming a notable bibliography, beginning with the works of the medievalist Jacques Le Goff. Monsterology regarding India was also a result of geography, to be accurate, of the psychological impact that geography had on the European West. If we look at medieval maps, which echo ancient geographers, as we said, India is depicted as the opposite of Europe. These antipodes can be perceived as the world behind the mirror, the world upside down. To this mentality, the European space is the dominion of God, the Christian ecumeny. This opposite world is a pagan world. This was the principal thought. The pagan world is a barbaric world, which, away from the one God, results being visually unhealthy, having been developed paradoxically in an abnormal way. However, it is interesting to note that this anomaly is not of the moral type in the medieval fantasy narratives. It is limited to the exoticism of a body almost alien to the Europeans, but still paradoxically normal, since after all nature has made it. There are other non-Indian tribes that were characterized as impure or demonic, the tribes of Gog and Magog of the story of Alexander and the sacred Christian texts. The Scythians, the people of Siberia, from the conqueror, whom the conqueror pushed beyond the Asian valley, outside the civilized world. The absence of moral condemnation in the case of India highlights the attraction that this unknown country had in the medieval Western thought. In effect, it is the only case where the Christian prohibition is overcome in favor of the freedom of imagination and a world in which everything is possible, ultimately a world closer to creation at the edges of the human world. After all, the Christian tradition had predicted that in the future, India could be included in the Christian ecumeny. André Filiusat has noted how early Christian writers wrongly attributed many places mentioned in the Old Testament to India, citing among others Ophir, from which King Solomon obtained gold, and Evilah, the land where gold is to be found according to Genesis. Moreover, following the diffusion of the apocryphal gospel, Acts and miracles of Thomas the Apostle in the Latin West, the belief that Thomas evangelized India shortly after the resurrection of Christ became pervasive. The Old Latin Acts of Thomas and miracles of Thomas recount the dispatch of Thomas to India by the resurrected Christ. From the late 13th century onwards, references to India will lose much of their vagueness. It is the age of travelers and merchants who were traveling to Cathay via Tanna, Ujjaini, and Al-Malik in safety, of the merchant and then diplomat Marco Polo, late 15th century, of the missionary Giovanni del Monte Corvino, late 13th century also, of papal legate Odorico de Pordenone, Giovanni Battista Ramusio, Ludovico da Vartema, etc. Now, we no longer have narratives, but itineraries of travelers, Franciscan and Dominican missionaries, of diplomats and merchants. Priorities and content may change. Nevertheless, many elements of the old mentality keep resisting. The case of the legendary priest King John, the governor of the three Indies, is typical. This individual is first named in the late 12th century Littera Presbyteris Ioannis, addressed ostensibly to the Greek Emperor Manuel Comnenus in 1165. Undoubtedly, it is a Western fiction. However, it was circulated widely as a fact. The influence and circulation of this legend persisted beyond 1500 in the writings of travelers such as Marco Polo, the Dominican Jordanus Catalan, De Severat and others. Paul identifies Priest John as Ung, that is on hand, and reports him as killed by Genghis in battle. In Mirabilia Descripta, Jordan places the land of Priest John in India Tertia, which he identifies with Ethiopia. Much more could be said about the tenacity with which the aforementioned elements, exoticism, fantasy accounts, stereotypes of the Christian narrative, coexist in the late Middle Ages with the realistic descriptions of people who actually visited India and experienced Indian culture no longer through books. Besides, after Marco Polo, many Italian merchants started visiting India to trade and to invest. Roberto Lopez identified 3 journeys to India made by Italian merchants within the century after Marco Polo's travels. Benedetto Vivaldi traveled from Genoa to Partilus, India in 1315. Loredano brothers of Venice traveled overland to Delhi in 1338, and Tommasino Gentile in 1343 took the sea route from Ormuz to China, changing ships on the west coast of India. At the end of the 16th century, common enterprises between Italians and Indians were finally forming long-term stable businesses. As a brief deduction, we must emphasize the mixed nature of all the medieval texts regarding India mentioned in this introductory presentation. Even in the works of people who visited the country, it is debatable whether the information given is true, or rather whether the authors actually witnessed what they were reporting. There is a very large part of texts that actually are variants of the original works and still puzzle experts as to their origin or function, for example, in Marco Polo's depiction of the world. Also, there are points that are either fictional additions or taken from previous or contemporary works. In any case, the one thing that can be accurately said is that there's a broad field of research regarding the medieval mentalities towards the regions of Bharat that may also bring significant results if approached interdisciplinarily. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for highlighting this quite central theme of the way that we power is things that to construct one's own identity. So
Kordosis, Venice, Pity. Όχι, όχι, πρέπει να το πιάσουμε πρώτα. Και μετά με το... Θέλει πατημένο το κουμπί.
So, as the last speaker of the section of the day, we will also give us some conclusions after the discussion. I would like to invite Professor Stefanos Kordosis of the International Hellenic University and sure about description of Inner India in Frederick Greek texts and commentary. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ronconi. Now, I know that being the last one, I have to meet up to your expectations and be as brief and succinct as possible. So I will do that. And I will start by thanking the organizers of this extremely important conference, Professor Vasilios Koukoussas and Professor Christos Arabatsis. I would also like to thank the funding organization behind me, which is the Ministry of Education of Greece, without the funding of which, through the internationalization program, I wouldn't be able to make it here today. And I will move straight into the topic. I will speak to you about a manuscript from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, a manuscript coded as Supplement Grec 1042. This is actually a copy of a manuscript found in the library of the Metochian the Holy Sepulchre in Constantinople and is numbered as 176 in the catalog of Hierosolymitiki Bibliotheki. I'm using this text because it was available to me. It was probably a text, a manuscript produced by the famous Emile Legrand and was acquired by the BNF in 1885. The manuscript contains several texts. The most important of these texts, and the one by which we were able to identify closely its point of origin, is the first text titled Biblos, a book in which the description of the itinerary to China through Siberia is described. And we understand from that the author or the source of this text is Nikolaos Patharis. Nikolaos Patharis, for those of you who don't know him, was a prominent member of the Pasolski Brigade, which was the ministry of ambassadors of Muscovy up until Peter the Great. He was a Greek in origin, half Greek, half Wallachian, and he compiled three main works for which he is known. One of them is this description of the itinerary to China through Siberia. But besides this text, which covers the bigger segment, the bigger part of the manuscript 1042, there are also other texts inside this manuscript. So in Delhi, for example, I identified one segment of the manuscript from page, I don't see the number, that's okay, from 219, I think, to 236, which was titled Description of the Caspian Sea. I identified the source, which is a translation from a Russian work that was produced in 1675. As you can see, the text conveys essentially the main trade stations found on the way from Astrakhan in the north of the Caspian Sea to Hyderabad in the Indian subcontinent. And the source of this information is essentially a Darozhnik, which is a travel guide, if we can put it in this way, that the Pasolski Prikaz, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Muscovy, produced for one of its ambassadors, not Patharis, but a Bukharan trade/ambassador who would visit India during Mughal times and Aurangzeb, Shah Aurangzeb, in 1675. So this is the document, the original source of the text that I presented to you in New Delhi. But besides that, there are also other segments that refer to India, although the information is very, very thin. So we have on page 215 of the same manuscript, a passage titled On the Routes to Bukharia and India. I will not describe here what the text is about. It is about the route from the Khanate of Bukhara to essentially Multan and the borders of the Indian Mughal Empire. But I will speak about the source. Here again, we have a direct translation from the Russian. And it is a translation from a text compiled in 1673, titled Список чертежа Сибирские земли, which is a sketch of the Siberian land. Now, Cheptyozhi sketches were something common as, let's say, texts containing information. They were descriptive geographical texts that the Muscovites produced, and through which they tried to produce sketches, that is, very, very simple maps of regions. So the source for this segment of the manuscript is this specific text, which was written compiled in 1673 by the Voyevoda of Siberia, the general governor of Siberia, a person named Yuri Godunov, not to be confused with the Tsar Godunov, but a different person. There is also another section called News on China and on the deepest India. Again, here, the information on India is very, very thin. Actually, the «Ведомость о китайской земле и о глубокой Индии» remained known simply as «Ведомость о Китае». That is information, news about China. They left India outside because the Russian text did not contain much information on India. But anyway, this text is also translated, which is all, as I said, a very small segment of the whole text. And I will now try to describe to you or answer to you just three questions. The first question was about the origin of the text in the manuscript that I started my lecture. So even though not all the texts from these manuscripts have been identified, we now know where to look at and make some more identifications. Secondly, who did the translations of these documents from Russian to finally Greek? Most of us, especially dealing with Greek history and the history of Greek book printing, we know the Slavic Greek Latin Academy in Moscow. It was founded in the middle of the 17th century, and the first who served there were the Lichudides brothers, and perhaps this academy is responsible for the translation. We don't know the translator, but definitely Spatharis, who also served in the academy, because the academy produced translators for the Pasovsky Prikaz, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So Spatharis obviously oversaw the translations. And the translations were commissioned by the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, by Dositheus II. Why would the Patriarch in Jerusalem would like to commission such translations? Well, the first thing is that he, being a part of the Greek intelligentsia, was interested in partaking into the geographical knowledge that was produced in the 16th and 17th century. But there was more than that, more mundane reasons. Dositheus II, even though a spiritual man, he was also very much interested in promoting the trade interests of his own community, the Greeks residing either in the Ottoman Empire or those who resided outside the Ottoman Empire. And therefore, he was very interested in acquiring as much information as possible on trade routes from especially the land routes that connected the three great empires in Eurasia at that time: the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, and the Mughal Indian Empire. Thank you for your attention. So, Professor, should I proceed with the?
Maybe we have the discussion.
Oh yeah, the discussion. Yes, you're right.
And then it's up.
Yes.
Okay. And thank you also for giving us back the 10 minutes we had lost. So, are there some questions or observations on the last section? Or may I say, even if there are questions more generally speaking or concerning the previous ones, it may be the moment to ask them. No? Sure. Please come here. Come here, please.
Thank you so much. My question is to Dr. Professor Anil Singh. I just want to ask only one thing, that as far as I know, when Alexander and his army moved some areas, and we know very well that he was very curious about the geography and flora and fauna of that area where he and his army moved. When they went to the northwestern region, they come to know about the gymnosophists living there, and as I know, he sent Onesicritus to talk to them, if I'm not wrong, and some sources tell that he directly met with them. So what was the output of that meeting? Just as far as I know, Onesicritus when he went in that region, and he comes to know about the Taprobani, as I told in my paper. So I want to know the output of that particular meeting. Thank you.
Yes. This is interesting. Okay. This. Professor Korre has said many things, and it was very, it has provoked me to say many things, but first I will answer your question. India was land of riches before coming of Alexander to India. Land of riches, land of marvels, land of, as he said, of the wonderful creatures. All these information about India was starting, whatever we have about the classical authors, starting from XIII-XVI up to the last, if we can say, to the Megasthenes who lived in the center of India. Before Alexander, India was the land of marvels, the land of riches. Even the sayings which are prevalent today about some of these parts like Haryana and Punjab of today are called the land of honey and land of milk and honey. There are rivers of honey and milk in India. Such type of stories are available in classical authors also. Tatius said something about it, Herodotus have. So these authors were quoting each other actually, starting from XIII onwards. They were quoting their previous authors, saying that, okay, he has written well, but I am presenting the right picture to you. The earlier one was, it was gossip, and what I am presenting is the true knowledge about India. All this was happening, and till this event took place. So Niarchos, Onesicritus, when they came to here, the event is like this, that Alexander was camping near the bank of the river Vyas, and some of his soldiers or his spies who were sent to see the forward movement, they came and said that there are some people who are naked and sitting in different postures. So he assigned the Onesicritus that he should go and see what is the matter, because Onesicritus was considered the most educated multilingual person amongst the generals of Alexander. So he went there, and with the help of two translators, as far as I know, with the help of two translators, he talked to these gymnosophists. There are lingual barriers about describing people, because gymnosophist is not, we cannot say Brahmins and Shermans as gymnosophists. Somebody presented gymnosophists as Shermans or Brahmins, but gymnosophist is entirely has a different meaning than Shermans and Brahmins. That is another lecture, if we will go on that what is the difference between gymnosophists and Shermans and Brahmins. So then Onesicritus talked to him and he got impressed, and he informed Alexander that these people are very wise people, they are philosophers, at highest caliber. Then sources say that Alexander then met, he requested Alexander, or Alexander said that he would like to meet, and then they invited these people, and this whole conversation of invitation and accepting or not accepting the invitation is also interesting. That initially they didn't accept the invitation of king, that what we have to do with the kings, because we are kings of our own land. The knowledgeable people shall not go to their kings, but kings shall come to the philosophers. All those things, but all these conversations also have the flavors of the local assumptions or philosophies regarding the debate between king and philosopher, who is starting from Vishwamitra, and the debate of Vishwamitra and Vashishth, debate between the Raja Rishi and Brahma Rishi in Indian side, and in Greek side, the concept of philosopher and king. These are also related to the whole this whole story. So India was a land of riches before this event took place. As soon as this meeting took place, because Alexander was the most powerful figure of that particular time, as today, whenever Prime Minister or President moves, there are lots of cameramen and journalists, and they report the event. So the courtiers of the Alexanders, or the generals of the Alexanders, or the wise persons of the Alexander, after this meeting, because Alexander was highly impressed, he gave gifts to them and he praised the knowledge of these. I will not use the word gymnosophists, because they were, in my view, they were Jain Shrmans. After this meeting, the India immediately became land of philosophers, because the event was reported everywhere. The chronicles were written and everything, that the meeting made India land of philosophers. And as far as my studies, whatever little I have studied, it was translated into around 40 languages in different parts of the world. And this event was, said in many things. So the impact was that India was already land of riches, marvels, etc., and then India became philosophers. And afterwards, because even before this event, Indian considered Greeks as wise people, and the same way Greeks were considered Indians as wise people. The Brahmins were saying, "Yadapi Yavana Maleksh hai, lekin pujni hai." Although Greeks are impure, but because they are very wise, they are respectable, highly respectable. So Indians were seeing Greeks in that way, and Greeks were also seeing Indians. So then onwards, in the Greek world, at least, Greek Hellenistic world, India was seen as land of philosophers as well. But then as per political and as per need of new empires, as per need of new political masters, constructions, religious as well as political, both Christian world versus others. These images are used to describe themselves better than others. So so the second one, the land of philosophers, India, that was the outcome.
You? Other questions or observations? Otherwise, I've got one for Dr. Korre and one for Frederick Lauritzen. For Dr. Korre, I would like to ask you, you've been speaking about the somehow positive vision of the Far East and of the Indian world, which is a little bit rare in Byzantine texts for non-Christian and non-Orthodox, but in general non-Christian peoples. And And you were speaking about this idea somehow of freedom. Orlando is so far that somehow it can be accepted to be a kind of deforming mirror of the Byzantines themselves, which allows them to be a little bit free. I would like to ask you, do you think it could also be due to the element of the East, where the sun goes up, which is found sometimes in Byzantine texts, ex oriente lux, also in the West, and I'm thinking about Photius of Constantinople in the 9th century, for instance, which says precisely that from the East comes wisdom and from the darkness of the West comes heresy. So this is my question. And then I would ask directly also the question to Frederick Lauritzen, and it's a very tiny question. You have shown this protocol address of the Administrando Imperio Constantine VII Porphyrogenus to the King of India, which is a model precisely, say for the ones from Byzantinology. It's somehow a recueil of models of letters and address to other sovereigns in other states somehow. And it is quite generic. I would say more generic than some others, which are addressed to other sovereigns, for instance, the Franks or other ones. So how do you interpret it? Is that because after all, it has to take into consideration all the people of the world, even if in Constantinople they have just heard of, or do you have other explanations? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Well, I think that we have to divide the answer in two main sections, chronologically speaking. The section before the dramatic for the Byzantium 13th century and the section after the 13th century. The section before the 13th century, there is the main idea, the Byzantine mentality, of course, based on a philosophical underground thought of ex oriente lux, that is, all the wise, all the saintness comes from Orient, exactly because the sun emerges from the Orient, and the sun represents in the Byzantine thought the wisdom, and the holy, the same wisdom, the wisdom of God. The light of the sun. I keep thinking in Italian. The light of the sun brings vividity, brings life to people, and the whole light of God creates the universe and brings light in the life of man. That is the main source of the mentality towards the East, and this affects the representations that Byzantines were making about India. They were, in fact, conceptualizing the philosophical and theological base of the conception of light. After the pragmatic 13th century for the Byzantine, that is, after the fall of Constantinople to the hands of the Crusaders, the Far East represents not only the luce, that this is the light of the wisdom, but also a possible region for allies, to find allies. The Byzantines faced the Mongol invasion, which stopped the Ottoman Turks into proceeding in Constantinople too early. but they were also expressing their ambiguous sentiments towards the West, the Westerners, who, after all, being Christians, gave to the whole region the suddenness, the night, the absence of brotherhood, the absence of light. And that means, if I keep thinking that in the last temptations of the Byzantine court of finding allies is in Armenia, that is east, and much more in regions of that part, if they in their mind could trace possible solution of finding army and kingdoms that were not in favor of the Westerners. And this way, I think that in the first chronological section, we can see, of course, the philosophical and theoretical underground about the Far East. India is inside the whole thing, and that affects it. But in the second part, it's a most realistic, political, pragmatic approach, the reapproach of the whole region. Of course, this is interpretation that they can do based on the whole landscape of temptations, thoughts, mentalities in Byzantium. Once the texts are studied much more, we could at least in effect end up in certain conclusions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo, for the question. So if I remember it, it's whether the formula addressing the king of the Indians or the leader of the Indians is a generic one. Basically, is it real or is it based on formulae, composition of these types of formulas? So I would say it's real because the other formulas which are present in that chapter in the Book of Ceremonies contain the golden bull that indicates that there's a XIII-XVI. The only one that doesn't is the Indian one. And I think that's due to the distance at which these letters are traveling. You can't guarantee that something of that preciousness would continue, because also it wasn't necessarily a guarantee of authenticity. That's why I showed the follies, which is a bronze coin, which has been found in India. I think gold coins in this period and silver ones were not found. If you had no particular interest in on the ruler depicted, you would melt it and use it for something else, because the gold was pure and the silver was pure. That's the immediate answer. One thing which I think is important, and I think you've underlined it, is that for us it's difficult to imagine such distances being covered, because we imagine that the Byzantine sphere in the middle period is limited to the area of what's now Turkey, Greece, the Balkans, part of Syria, and not much else, contact with southern Italy. There is a problem with that, and that is the case of Sudan. There's a site of Dongola, which has been excavated by the Poles for years now, 60 years, which has Greek inscriptions, which are not formulas, until the 13th century. So it's clear that there are Greek speakers who are going there and writing on the walls. Now, that means that the route down the Nile beyond Egypt is actually available. That means the route for the monsoons is also available, because once you're there, you're close. So that's a geography that's much wider than what we imagine. That's on one side. It also means that the Byzantine envoys, such as ambassadors or merchants, could cross Fatimid lands, when Egypt was Fatimid, and get to the Christian Chalcedonian country on the other side without too much trouble. I don't know how, but they did it, got there and wrote on the gates. So that's one thing. The other thing which limits this geography on the Indian side, I talked about a narrative which I think works well until about 1205 for what concerns northern India. If I'm not mistaken, please forgive me if I'm saying all sorts of wrong things. That's the year when the Sultanate of Delhi is established. So that means a link with the northwest and a change of geography, which is radical, and means that from an outsider's point of view, the monsoon route is less interesting. The monsoon route is interesting if the mountains are dividing two different peoples, but once that's an old Indian question. So I think the problem with the 10th, 11th century geography is that it's unclear on the Byzantine side, and it might be still much more open towards India than what we expect from the Mediterranean. Thanks.
So the time has come to draw conclusions from our gathering today. But before doing that, I, being a member of the organizing committee at the same time, would like to thank the main contributors of this event, Professor Vasilios Koukousas and Professor Arabatzis of the Hellenic Institute of Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies in Venice, and of course, the Greek chair in the School of Languages, Literature, and Cultural Studies of Jawaharlal Nehru University. To save us some time, I've decided to group the announcements into several categories based on what I found as being common in them. So I will start with metaphysics and philosophy, which, as expected, were greatly honored by I suppose the bigger number of the participants and speakers today. The announcement of Professor Anil Kosvani and of course of Dr. Gianluigi Sagalerba refer to the common elements of Neoplatonic philosophy with the Vedic traditions of India. Particularly, they drew relations between Ammonius Saccas and his pupil, his disciple, Plotinus, and they spoke about the perception of reality by the subject. As Professor Kosvani remarked, a lot of these approaches and notions were also transplanted into the Christian metaphysical works of the early Christian ages. Along the same, not so much in metaphysics, but also within the religious sphere, we heard a very interesting announcement by Professor Pachis, who expanded on the career of Dionysus, or Osiris, as he was also identified with, into the lands of India. Even though the announcement also had Byzantine, let's say, aspects, Dr. Delphine Lauritzen's announcement on the magnificent and very extensive poem of Nonnus of Panopolis was also very, very interesting because it conveyed, she conveyed her take on the notion of metempsychosis and why the creator of the poem did not move on to the other element of metempsychosis, which is metempsychosis. within the period of ancient times. Professor Vinay Kumar's very interesting announcement on certain motifs coming from the Greco-Buddhist Gandharan art, which developed during the Mauryan Empire period. Particularly, he emphasized on the motif of the honeysuckle, which he identified with the anthemion motif originating in the Greek artistic style. Interestingly, we've had a number of topics on Byzantium and India. Professor Paschalis Androudis, of course, I mentioned already Dr. Lauritzen, but also Professor Paschalis Androudis and Professor Ronconi with Professor Arabadzis referred to this two aspects of Byzantine perceptions of India. Professor Androudis focused on certain iconographic themes of Byzantine art, while Professor Ronconi and Professor Arabadzis highlighted common elements in various aspects of Byzantine ascetic traditions. And of course, Frederick Lauritzen's announcement also falls within the same field, by bringing to our notice various texts from the Byzantine tradition, especially the Bahram and the Yosef text. Professor Lauritzen highlighted the connections between Byzantine literature and Sanskrit literary traditions. Again, within the same sphere, Professor Katerina B of the University of Patras conveyed to us not only the Byzantine perceptions of India through multiple Byzantine texts, but also later medieval Western texts on India from a period when the myth was replaced by observation, by people who actually traveled in the lands towards India and in India itself. Professor Manisa Thiaki, forgive me if I mispronounce the name, was the only announcement that referred to Haprobani, to Sri Lanka, and to the importance of the southern regions of the Indian subcontinent in India's trade relations and other exchanges with the West, and particularly the Greek world. We have also had two, in my opinion, extremely interesting approaches to Indo-Hellenic relations. Because they were viewed through the prism of current times. So I'm referring to Professor Anja Sharma, who touched upon the British colonial view of Greeks and Indians, and of Greco-Indian relations, while Professor Sima Yadav gave us a sketch of the broader geopolitical dimensions that these historical contexts have nowadays. I hope I have not forgotten anyone from our very esteemed speakers. But I would like to thank you all for your participation here today. It was an extremely important gathering, conference, and one in which we also received great news from New Delhi about the PhD program. And before closing, there is an announcement I would like to make for tomorrow. As I understood, most of you, or if not all of you, have already visited the Museum of Icons. So as Professor Kukusas mentioned to me, the visit tomorrow is cancelled. Oh, okay. So it is not cancelled by, excuse me. But those of you who have already visited, you may go and visit whichever other place of Venice you like. Is there anything?
What time?
The meeting time for the visit to the museum is 11:30 in the morning. In front of the church, right opposite. Yes, right next to where we are. And yes, thank you very much, and I hope I'll see you again.